textual representations and what John Paul II, speaking as the philosopher Carol Botia, calls pornovision. In an interesting piece on the theology of the body, John Paul uses the term to distinguish films and videos from pornography, which refers to literally to literature or writing. His argument is that the very nature of modern social communications and the mass media is such that human dignity is offended when the body's intimacy is withdrawn from interpersonal relations and exposed to an unknown audience. Quote, "The human body is a manifestation of the person and of his or her self-giving to another who can respond in an equal and personal way," close quote. By turning what belongs to intimacy, to privacy, and to public property, the, quote, self-giving is, as it were, suspended in a dimension of unknown reception and unforeseeable response. I'm still quoting. "The truth about human beings, by reason of their bodies, is especially personal and interior and creates limits which it is not licit to go beyond. The whole problem of pornovision is not the result of a puritanical morality or a narrow moralism. It is a matter of very fundamental values in the face of which we cannot remain indifferent," close quote. Now, what's interesting about this argument is the explicit distinction between forms of representation and the fact that the moral concern can be raised but without launching into dubious and inflated insistence on cause, on a correspondence theory between pornographic representation X and unfortunate outcome Y. Now, I want to push this just a little bit further, linking up John Paul's arguments with those from a French feminist named Nancy Houston. Pornovision, in her view, is powerful in part because it consists of representations that involve the actions of real persons, which again is unlike texts. This compels us to look more closely at the interaction between narrative and reality, visual narrative in this instance. If we reject a crude mimetic understanding, we are still left with powerful puzzlements. That is, if we draw the reality effects in narrative into a one-to-one correspondence to narrative effects in reality, we oversimplify. But if we insist upon an absolute disjuncture between narrative and reality, between the two, we wind up defending the status quo, which encourages some to, quote, jubilate in imaginary pleasure while real women writhe in pain. She's talking about sadomasochistic pornography. So we must ask ourselves, what exactly is the nature of the relationship between the representation and the reality of commercialized eroticism, of pornovision? 3. Michael Ignatieff, in an essay, Homosexualis, in the London Review of Books, asks the Foucauldian question, why is sex so important to us anyway? What has the late 20th century culture of narcissism, why has it embraced homosexualis as its definition of human essence? Why has sex and our gendered identities become the central part of our being, the privileged site in which the truth of ourselves is to be found? If we pose these questions, according to Ignatieff, in a Foucauldian vein, we can locate much feminist discourse on the eternal antinomy between female desire, which is constituted as an unspoiled pool of pure eroticism, in opposition to patriarchal evil, as an attempt to push the view that sexuality is a continuous natural object of historical discourse, which is a position that Foucault stoutly rejects. Okay. I'm going to skip some stuff because I've gone over my time. Let me draw this to a conclusion. The paradox and peril of the present moment is this. By not tending to the relation between inner worlds and outer life, we make more likely moves to reconstruct people rather than to change the contexts in which they find themselves. We cannot tend democratically to the porn problem through language of total community or language of absolute or nearly so freedom of expression, freedom from constraint. But we can move towards reflection on available options by drawing from conservatives the insistence that the character of human beings matters and that this character is related to the context in which people live. We can draw from feminist protests generally the imperative that women are or must be free to become full civic human beings. Perhaps in the question and answer period we might go over what some of these strategies must be. But let me just add in conclusion that to the extent that pornography is symptomatic of and helps to further modes of social disintegration, creating contexts in which the least powerful, who are not women but children, suffer the most, it becomes an appropriate target for action and regulation and reproof. But with this proviso, knowing that we cannot return to a wholly harmonious way of life in which we share completely a set of moral values. This means communities must leave space for putting pornography in its place rather than seeking to eradicate it altogether. Here, the language and reality of First Amendment freedoms can chasten overly zealous efforts to create or demand a coerced consensus. If we move this direction, we might break free from the unacceptable alternatives our civil society seems to throw up with great consistency, as I've already stated, freedom versus community, virtue versus vice, liberty versus constraint. At the conclusion of Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud bowed to the reproach that he had no consolation to offer. Quote, for at bottom, that is what they are all demanding, the wildest revolutionaries, no less passionately than the most virtuous believers. As I end this discussion, I bow to the reproach that I have offered no solutions, having shared with you instead these reflections of a concerned citizen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Elshtain. Now to respond to her talk, Professor Michael Sandel.
Thank you. Professor Elshtain began by thanking the audience for having braved the snow tonight. And I would like, in the same spirit, to praise the audience for having so wisely resolved tonight's difficult choice between President Reagan's State of the Union address on the one hand and pornography on the other. I hope John M. Olin will forgive me. The embarrassment that I find myself in is that, having agreed to respond, I have very little with which to disagree. Professor Elshtain's talk seems to me rich and sensitive and complex, and I feel something of a burden to argue back. And so rather than argue back in my own voice, which wouldn't make for a very strong or persuasive argument, I thought I would acquit my responsibility by trying to imagine, to think as I listened to Professor Elshtain's talk, to imagine the sort of objection that would be made, even though I myself wouldn't make it, by the advocate of one of the main positions that she spoke about in her talk, and one of the main strands in our public debate about pornography, namely civil libertarians, those who are against any restraint on pornography at all, people who are against censorship of any kind and of any form. They are a ghost at the table in this discussion. And so I thought I would at least honor that ghost by trying to imagine the sort of response that someone with that view might offer. And it seems to me there are a handful of possible responses which would be offered by a person of such a view. And it seems to me that Professor Elshtain and others who hold views such as hers would have to be able to respond to these arguments, and so I'll just suggest the ones that occurred to me as I was listening. Whether the civil libertarian says that there ought to be no limits to toleration where free speech is concerned, and for several reasons. One reason is who is to judge what is a work of literature or of political speech on the one hand, and what is trash or filth, unworthy of public display or sale on the other? These are matters of taste, of subjective preference. People have different views about these things. So who is to judge? And the implicit answer to that question is no one, or rather everyone for him and herself in the marketplace. To refuse and to turn away from pornography, or to buy it, or simply to be indifferent to it. That would be, call that the relativist argument of the civil libertarian, that there is no inherent worth in what many people agree are great works of literature and art, but that it's a matter of subjective preference and that these values are entirely relative. A second argument the civil libertarian ghost at the table might make would be not relativist but practical. It would be something like this. There is a slippery slope that you embark on and open yourself to once you acknowledge that there are limits to toleration in the area of speech and expression. Even if there are objective standards and intrinsic, and even if there is some intrinsic merit to certain works by contrast to others, in a complicated political system such as ours, where consensus is hard won, especially on things as controversial as this, surely any attempt to legislate limits is bound to backfire. What about, this is the familiar argument, look, if Hustler today, Ulysses tomorrow. So that's the practical argument, because it's not an argument that denies there's any intrinsic difference in the quality of these expressions, but it says as a matter of practical fact, if you open the way once, you've opened the way for all time in banning and censoring possibly worthwhile things. And a third possible argument, so we have the relativist and the practical arguments. A third one made by civil libertarians would be what we might call the categorical argument. Even practicality aside, it's wrong to infringe on people's rights to make their own decisions about these matters. Professor Elstein spoke about a certain liberal view of the importance of choosing for oneself, and it's a view such as this to which the civil libertarian appeals, persuasively appeals, when he or she says, quite apart from the merit of the choice that you or I or somebody else makes in the marketplace, it's not our business, so long as that person isn't harming us directly. It's not our business to violate that choice. To the contrary, to do so, however awful a choice it might be, would be an offense against the dignity of persons, which requires respect for the free exercise of autonomy and individual choice. So the relativist, the practical, and the categorical grounds for toleration or permissiveness in the case of pornography, these seem to be the main arguments that the civil libertarian ghost at the table might offer. And distinguishing these three and establishing these three possible grounds is really the issue of political theory, it seems to me, that arises and needs to be addressed by those who would be other than absolute tolerance when it comes to pornography. These three possible grounds for toleration occurred to me as I was listening to Professor Elstein, although they also occurred to me, this is just to illuminate these three categories, I first reflected on the grounds of permissiveness or toleration. Before I started studying political theory, the first time I brought home a date to my parents when they didn't complain or object. And I wondered then what the grounds for their permissiveness was. It might have been, I speculated, why aren't they giving me a hard time? I know they don't approve. And I thought one reason might be that they just think it's a matter of taste. It's a matter of subjective preference, whom he happens to be happy with. Who are we to say to second judge? Who are we to judge? I quickly dismissed that as a possibility. Another possibility would be that occurred to me, maybe they have a categorical, I didn't know the term then, but maybe they have a categorical ground for their permissiveness. Maybe they think I have a right freely to choose for myself, and that it would be an offense against my dignity for them to interfere. And I quickly rejected that one as well. No parents are relativists or categorical theorists when it comes to permissiveness, at least no parents I've ever had. The more plausible possibility for their permissiveness, I thought, was the second, the practical one, that she's awful, she's not for him, but if we interfere now, it will only backfire. And they were examined. I should say, just to establish my credentials in that critical respect, I should mention just briefly the answers that seem to me available to the ghost at the table who would make those three arguments. The first one, the relativist one, is questionable for civil libertarians because it's so much at odds with with the other arguments they make. For example, no civil libertarian defends Ulysses by saying, but then what about Hustler? It's always the other way around, and the asymmetry there already presupposes that they have some view about intrinsic merit, and they're worried about the way it will work out if it's violated in cases where there is no intrinsic merit. So the relativist one is rhetorically embarrassing for the civil libertarian in that way. The practical argument about making the world safe for Ulysses, that one seems to me probably now, historically, empirically, a weak argument, because the way to make the world safe for James Joyce probably isn't, in our present political climate, to insist on the full prerogatives of Larry Flint. To the contrary, it may be that preserving a measure of toleration and openness in a society may require limits on the extravagant claims on behalf of pornography and other forms of discourse and other sorts of practices that lead to frustration and discontent and impatience with the forms of constitutional democracy and political restraint. The way to make the world safe for Ulysses may precisely be to establish and insist on certain limits in other more extreme cases. And finally, in the case of the categorical argument, the idea about free speech being absolute as a right, where any expression at all counts as speech. Well, if this may not be a decisive argument against that, but there is, it seems to me, at least an irony in this position by the civil libertarian, because it amounts to a defense of free speech at the expense of the dignity of speech. And it doesn't take seriously, this argument, the power of speech and of expression totalitarian regimes, and this, it seems to me, is the irony, totalitarian regimes who censor, sometimes brutally and ruthlessly censor, forms of political and artistic expression, in a certain way take talk and art and expression more seriously rather than less. They're capable of being threatened by it. When the Chinese Cultural Revolution banned Beethoven, they took seriously the power of Beethoven and the meaning of his music to make a difference, a moral or a political difference. And so it was when Plato banished the artists and when Stalin slaughtered the blind ethnic folk singers who roamed the countryside. He slaughtered them, and his ruthlessness in an odd and abominable way, his ruthlessness acknowledged the force and the power and the subversiveness, possibly, of their songs. And so it seems to me an irony of civil libertarians, insofar as they depend on the categorical ground for absolute tolerance, that they defend free speech by acknowledging the sense in which it's disempowered, unthreatening, by assuming, and maybe rightly in our society, that
pornography flourished and were shown privately for the edification of Hitler, Goebbels, and all the rest, often portraying Jews as the subjects of particular forms of sexual victimization. Okay, what would you guys say? Yeah, why don't you do that? There's somebody up there.
Questions from the audience? Would you please go to a microphone to ask?
Okay. No?
Yeah,
It's on.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I am, for the last 2 years before I came to the Kennedy School, a statewide officer in the Minnesota Women's Political Caucus. The statement I want to make is that my organization, as well as 110 women's organizations representing more than 200,000 women in the state, supported the anti-pornography ordinance. And we were very angry when Don Fraser, who's been our friend for years as a feminist, vetoed that ordinance. The statement that I'm making is we're not radical, weirdo feminists. We're more than 200,000 women in the state of Minnesota. And I think that that point needs to be made. Let's clarify that issue about what really happened in Minnesota. The only organization, the only women's group that did not support was the Jewish Women's Organization, because they were tied into the Civil Liberties Union and the screws were put to them and they couldn't. Okay?
That's
Thank
a rather demeaning attitude towards the Jewish Women's
It
Organization.
wasn't. They made their statement very clearly. They could not support it because of their ties to the Civil Liberties Union. It is not to be demeaning. The other 109 organizations supported the ordinance.
A question?
Yeah.
From yes.
I guess I might as well respond. In unanimity, there is correctness. But anyway, let's see. What I'd really like is for Professor Elstein to finish your talk. But barring that, I'll ask the following question. Don't you think that the anti-pornographers would have better claim to their cause if they defined pornography differently? Ripperography, or depicting sordid things such as the explicitly harmful things you mentioned, or that ordinance mentions, is bad, isn't it? I mean, it's bad, even if some romance novels or sculptures like Milo's Venus or paintings like Botticelli's Venus may not be?
Yeah, I think that that's an important, your question is an important one in terms of whether we might think about ways to understand pornography. And I was getting at that at the end in terms of perhaps a distinction between representations in a literary text and pornovision or pictorial visual representations which involve the actual actions of persons involved in this activity. That might be one place to begin to think about the issues that you raise. But you suggest that we might try to think more complicatedly than we have about the distinction between erotic representations and violent representations that involve sexuality. Unfortunately, the Minneapolis Ordinance blurred all that together. We don't have, on any of these issues, really overwhelming knockdown evidence about the ultimate effects of people's viewing or viewing films or seeing particular kinds of text. But the evidence such as it exists, and again, there's no one-to-one correlation between seeing a film and engaging in a behavior, suggests that violent representations, with or without sexual content, are more coarsening in terms of our attitudes towards others, males, females, children, other members of the human community, than erotica as such. You know, this distinction is one that hasn't been pushed as strongly as it should, and it immediately muddies the waters. And I think we have to keep muddying the waters so we don't wind up with over-clarity on this issue no matter how many people favor it. Muddies the waters in terms of the question of pornography and our concerns about who's in and who's out of the human community and on what terms. That perhaps if we looked more closely than we have at violence, which means, and violent representation, which means immediately we can't construe it simply, where's my interlocutor? I can't see, I'm looking for him and I can't see him. Oh, okay, that we can't, okay, there you are. That we can't see it as a simple matter of male versus female, but it becomes a more complicated issue in terms of the question of violence, then I think we might be onto something more important and be able to come up with a moral vocabulary that allows room for discussion without immediately locating one whole set of members of the human community in terms of the Dworkin and et al. Argument, men as such, you know, as the implacable enemy or foe or other. Let me add again that I think we really have to think about the issue I raised in terms of the mirroring of the visions of the pornographers and the radical feminists. They really do require one another and hold one another intact. And if we don't understand that in terms of what's going on, we're missing a very important dimension of the problem. There's more to say on what you on the implications of your question, and let me add very quickly that there are some series of Supreme Court decisions having to do with, you know, local communities, their power in this matter, and so on. But most of them relate to erotic representations and don't deal with the issue of violence per se.
I'd like to go back to Professor Sandel's point, or relativist category, and go back to the distinction between a magazine like Hustler and something like Joyce's Ulysses. First of all, it seems to me that the criteria which we use to judge them is different. That our choice that Ulysses is not Hustler has to do with what we think of it as a literary work, its importance in terms of literary development, Joyce's use of language, whatever. And that ultimately comes into play when we make some decision about its merits as language and as literature. I suppose one could make the same argument about Hustler, but I'd be less sure of that. So in that sense, the distinction is one which is a lot easier to make, it seems. It seems to me that the difficulty of who is to choose becomes more difficult when we talk about people like Henry Miller, or even at another level, someone like Sidney Sheldon, where one can't make some of the literary arguments, and certainly arguments have been made about, certainly with someone like Miller in Tropic of Capricorn, that this is basically pornography. And it seems to me that that is the point at which it becomes difficult to answer the question, who would choose, and that the distinctions become much more difficult to make.
I agree with that, but that seems to me an argument for deciding the hard cases and the difficult cases locally, rather than nationalizing these questions and insisting on a single answer to them. If there are communities that are deeply offended by Henry Miller and therefore don't want it in the school library, then let them make that decision and don't insist on a national standard. There is no avoiding hard choices and difficult calls and borderline cases, but that seems to me an argument in favor of a more decentralized way of deciding these questions rather than a single uniform national decision which would simply impose universally the resolution of that very difficult case.
Let me just add, in terms of the unavoidability of hard cases, that if you really try to democratize this issue, to think of it in terms of activating politics at the periphery and what that might involve, there are some Supreme Court decisions that, in a sense, constitute enabling legislation in this regard, however cumbersome they may be. The 1973 Miller versus California test, again, a rather cumbersome three-part test for obscenity, but the Hamlin case, 74, concerning contemporary community standards, the Paris Adult Theater versus Slayton case in terms of restricting, not eliminating, but restricting pornography, zoning it. There's something like 25 communities in Massachusetts that have worked towards locating pornography on the periphery in terms of or pornographic establishments, shops which sold pornographic paraphernalia. And again, not eliminating it, but locating it in particular areas of the community. Let me just indicate, in terms of the community initiative and standard or possibility in my concern with democracy, that I don't think the move towards litigious strategies that involve immediately put one into a situation of court adjudication, that to my mind doesn't constitute a democratic or a popular strategy in terms of dealing with this issue.
Question up here.
Yes, something that surprises me.
Where are we? Oh, okay.
What surprises me about the discussion is that whether it's from the standpoint of the civil libertarian or the radical feminist or the wishy-washy liberal who would rather stay agnostic about it, is that we're always proceeding on the parliamentary assumption that our politics and the way we seek to change the civil society of America is absolutely coextensive with the activity of the state. And I just want to ask, whatever happened to the good old extra-parliamentary syndicalism that's dominated feminism and all forms of radical thought for centuries up until the failure of what I take to be this project of the 60s? Mm-hmm. There would be two forms of civil libertarianism here that I think would need to be distinguished. The first would be the conventional establishment form, which would identify a categorical civil libertarian position as a part of an overall liberal ideology of negative liberty. And I think that both of you have given a very developed critique of that. But there would be another more ad hoc, practical civil libertarianism, which would be the simple tactical forswearing of anything to do with the mechanism of the state. And as I take the current strategy, the anti-pornography radical feminists, what many of them are doing that's new is identifying the movement of the feminist anti-pornographers with what Indianapolis male-dominated courts and legislatures and police forces are going to be doing against their erstwhile pornographic enemies. And I wanted to ask what you think feminism can do with extra-parliamentary activity from here on out.
I'm not quite sure why your second example constitutes wholly extra-parliamentary activity, but I may simply not be understanding fully what all you're packing into the example. There's a history in terms of the history of feminism in the United States of the kind of activity you're talking about. And I take extra-parliamentary activity to mean, among other things, moves to create alternative communities, attempts to, in a sense, to persuade through a kind of example, forms of living moral persuasion that don't finally call on the police powers of the state. Because I think that's why that's extra-parliamentary, I'm not at all sure. It seems to me that finally feminism has been really caught between movements towards more, through persuasion and serious democratic and localist politics, movements towards a larger and more generous vision of democratic civil life, between that and an immediate sort of leap to calling upon the state that they otherwise often mistrust, to put into place and to coerce or to enforce a particular view that they have of what constitutes, among other things, proper moral behavior on the part of individuals or particular classes or categories of individuals. So there's always been that tension. I think is detailed in much of the interesting social history. We now have women's studies coming out of the 19th century between movement towards a statist position and calling upon the police powers of the state, and movements towards an extra parliamentary, more democratic a posture and set of possibilities. And I see that tension there in terms of this current movement. I don't think it's readily resolvable, as I indicated, within the vocabulary that tends to predominate our discourse that both Professor Sandel and I have talked about. But as well, it's certainly not resolvable if you begin from the set of presumptions about males, about men, as an ontological given, as an other by definition, with which many of the spokeswomen and writers who've articulated the radical feminist anti-pornography position with which they began. That's one of my central objections, is objection of many feminists who are concerned about this issue.
Question here.
Yeah, I have another radical opinion in question number 473.2. And I don't see that porn, and I don't include here child and coercive porn, where the people involved in the photography or literature were coerced or had to participate in it. I don't see where this kind of porn indicates social decay. I don't see any evidence that proves that porn, as may exist in Playboy, Penthouse, or maybe Hustler, has a bad influence on society. And I think that if a person wishes to obtain a piece of porn, but then he has a First Amendment guarantee to obtain that, and I guess I also feel, I don't understand where anti-pornographers get off figuring that A, porn is bad, and then B, imposing that opinion on other people and restricting other people's ability to get this stuff. All they have to do is ignore it.
Well, I just think you've articulated very well much of the position of the ghost at the table that Professor Sandel talked about. And I think, again, there is great force to the argument, but that finally, I would simply be repeating myself if I answered you. Finally, I think it's a bit too simple in terms of if you see pornography as a signifier of some sort, as a representation of some sort, that must be interpreted in terms of what it tells us about ourselves, how we're living, what we're about as a human community, then I think the proliferation of it and the particular forms that it takes and the coarseness that it takes and the, in a sense, the aesthetic offense that some of it represents becomes, I think, an important issue for us to reflect on.
All right.
Perhaps speaking on behalf of some of the wishy-washy liberals, it's very hard to see still from a political standpoint and from a practical standpoint how we can avoid working at one pole or the other. I don't believe that the women of Minneapolis, are necessarily radical crazies who hate men. Probably very much the contrary. But more like people who people who see no choice but to go to one extreme or the other. Now you're saying that we don't, from a national standpoint, we don't have to necessarily set absolute guidelines. But then what happens when in localization we wind up with things like the Island Tree School District saying that what Poe and J.D. Salinger are inappropriate, and aren't standards in Mississippi going to be very different than standards in Boston, Massachusetts? And how can this avoid being extraordinarily litigious and drawn out and an unbelievable hassle for as long as we can see in the future?
I think that the Long Island School District case is a good example of precisely the difficult boundary line that lands so often in the courts. Why does the Supreme Court of the United States have to be in the business of deciding whether a particular book should or shouldn't be included in the school library of that community? The court opinion itself was incoherent insofar as it couldn't answer the question if the book hadn't been bought in the first place and then taken out. And if there's a constitutional right that the book now be put back in, doesn't it follow from that all those school districts that didn't buy that book in the first place have to go out and buy the book? But I think there are ways of addressing these questions without resorting to litigiousness. For my part, I'm sympathetic to the Minneapolis ordinance, although I think it's a clumsy instrument, and it partakes of the individualist, rights-oriented political discourse, which I think is not the best way of capturing the objection to pornography. But just sitting, I haven't really thought till tonight about practical political expressions of this, but listening to some of the discussion about non-litigious, even non-parliamentary solutions, suppose in a community group who felt offended by pornography, instead of going to court, this is really very much off the top of my head, maybe it's entirely wrong, but instead of going to court, instead even of asking the legislature to pass an ordinance, took photographs of the clients of the local pornography store and bought space on a billboard to display them. Now, maybe the people displayed, some of the people displayed in this way would be ashamed to be displayed as having patronized the pornographic store. Maybe some of them wouldn't be ashamed. Maybe the surrounding culture and community would have values such that when they saw someone on a billboard who had patronized a pornography shop, they wouldn't condemn him or think ill of him. Well, if that were the case, then it would be an accurate measure of the community standards, that the few people taking pictures would be engaged in a futile exercise, an exercise that in that community wouldn't deserve to succeed in closing the pornographic bookstore, because it did fit more or less with community standards and the reigning conception of the good. On the other hand, if there were enough people who were ashamed to have their photograph on a billboard having been identified as patron of the local pornographic bookstore, the very grounds for shame that it would have some purchase here would be a measure of the conception of the good life reigning in that community. It would have bite, this practice, without, insofar as it had the capacity to humiliate this practice, it would exercise the deterrent effect, but the deterrent effect would be parasitic on certain notions of community value and shame and pride and humiliation, in the absence of which it wouldn't work, but then it probably wouldn't deserve to work because the community standards would be such in virtue of that pornography should be accepted in this community. That would be one example of a non-litigious, non-parliamentary, but deeply, in the classical sense, political response.
There's even a theme song that you could have blaring through a loudspeaker as people are being photographed. The song by the rock group Police, every move, what's the line? Every move you make, every breath you take, I'll be watching you. So we have a strategy and a theme song. We're set to go, I think, with this.
Try that in Minneapolis.
Right.
And see how it goes.
With that, I'm afraid we have to close tonight. Our very great thanks to both speakers.
Thank you.